Welcome to the Emotional Balance Sheet, the go-to podcast for parents with multiple kids, especially those with twins, triplets, or more, who are navigating the maze of modern family life and personal finance. Whether you're overwhelmed by education or retirement planning, parenting dilemmas, career transitions, or trying to define your purpose and plan, we're here to guide you with empathy, encouragement, and expertise. Hosted by Paul Fenner, founder of Tama Capital, a certified financial planner and parent to 4 kids, including a set of triplets. Our podcast is your ally in the quest for financial peace of mind, proving that money matters, but family comes first. Subscribe now and join our community of empowered parents at tamacapital.com. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon for investment decisions. Clients of Tama may retain positions in the securities discussed in this podcast.
What does comprehensive financial planning even mean? At Tama Capital, it means a family office where lifestyle planning such as retirement, college, portfolio management, and tax prep and planning are all under one umbrella. But it goes beyond numbers. We focus as much on the emotional side of financial planning as we do on the financial side. We get you. We understand your challenges of building a family, business or career, and a healthy life. We are devoted to wealth planning for families like yours because we are you. Learn how our family can help your family by visiting tamacapital.com. What if you had a front row seat to the world stage in the Oval Office? Sounds like a cool gig, right? But what if it required giving up much of your personal life? I welcome back former AP White House correspondent Ben Feller for a candid conversation about the evolving landscape of the media, the importance of journalistic integrity, and the personal journey of navigating a high-stakes career. Ben shares stories from his front row seat covering Republican and Democratic presidents and discusses why the real-time press access to pivotal moments like the Oval Office meetings with world leaders matters for democracy and public accountability. Just as important, we dive deeper into broader themes such as personal growth, identity, and the emotional transition from a demanding career into new chapters of life. There's plenty of wisdom for professionals, families, or anyone curious about the media's role in society in this episode, and it proves to be a must-listen to sort out facts from the noise and find emotional balance in a fast-paced world. Please enjoy my conversation with Ben Feller. All right, Ben Feller, welcome back to the Emotional Balance Sheet podcast.
Paul, it's great to chat with you again. Thanks for inviting me back. How you been?
I've been good. And as we were talking about before we actually hit record, it's hard, I can't imagine this. It's been 3 years, March of 2020. I'm looking at the paper now of our last conversation when you launched your book, Big Problems, Little Problems. And we're going to talk about your previous career. We're going to talk about what you're currently doing, how your son is doing, how the book's doing. And the one thing I wrote down too is when I read your title of your book, Big Problems, Little Problems, it's about you and your son's journey. But I'm also now interested in figuring out, well, how does this play into the political and social worlds of today? Are we dealing with big problems, little problems, and where do we take this? So I know that you're really active on LinkedIn, as am I, and you wrote this post several months ago when basically like the AP got locked out of the Oval Office and Air Force One. And I think that's kind of the place I wanted to start. And I know there's another story I think is important for you to weave in of your son and this, trying to get Aaron Judge's signature. So I wanted to start there with that piece that you wrote and have you walk through us like why you wrote it, a couple of the real major points that you wanted to get across and why all of us should care, no matter if we're a Republican or a Democrat.
Yeah, well, Paul, thanks again for the opportunity to chat about this. The events have changed since that piece ran, but the principles are still really important. So just to give your listeners a little bit of context, in my former life as a journalist, I was the chief White House correspondent for the Associated Press, which is the news service that serves the whole world. And one of the main jobs that we have is covering Washington, D.C. for the world. And the AP White House correspondent sat in the front seat of the first row of the briefing room, front seat of history, went into the Oval Office when the press pool was allowed in, traveled with the president on Air Force One. And the AP was often seen as the leader of the press corps, given both its decades and decades of history, but also because of its reach. Local news around the world often gets the news from the AP. And President Trump, in his second term, has used his power to right a lot of wrongs in his view and go after law firms, universities, the press corps that he thinks has been unfair to him in the first term. And one of his actions was to ban the Associated Press from coming into the Oval Office and traveling with him on the plane. And the list just goes on and on of the places where AP was not allowed to go because the president had changed the name of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. AP said, we will recognize that, that you've changed it for domestic audiences, but the Gulf of Mexico is an international body, and there's a lot of countries around the world, and we serve them all, and they still call it what it's been called for a very long time. So the really arcane point, the AP style book and how they refer to this body of water below Mexico, not the kind of thing that people voted Trump in to take care of. They're focused on the cost of eggs and immigration and, college tuition. But to the president, he says, hey, I've decided to call it that. And if you news service don't do what I say, we're going to restrict your access. And so that eventually went to court, and a judge ruled, look, you don't have to call on the AP first, which was tradition, but you can't tell a news organization what to say and what not to say as a condition for coverage. That violates the First Amendment. And, while all that was happening, the point of my piece was to say this is not about a fight between while all that was happening, my point of the piece was to say this is not about a fight between a news service and a president. It's much, much bigger than that. You have to understand what the fight is about is the ability for the press corps to freely and accurately cover the government. That's so important to people. You can't tell us what to say. I mean, that's so central to fair and accurate coverage, is to be able to hold truth to power. But also, why is it even important whether the AP or Bloomberg or Reuters is in the room? What does it matter? Well, it matters intensely whether you're in the room, because you get to see and feel what's actually happening so that you can tell the rest of the world. That's why there is a press corps.
Okay, Ben, so you were saying we had a slight technical difficulty, but you were explaining going into the kind of the White House showdown between Zelensky and Trump, and why that was important to have the news outlets there.
Yes. So why this story is so important to everyone is the AP and the other news agencies have access to the Oval Office. It's because you're able to see and feel what's actually happening and be able to report it in real time. So when President Trump and Vice President Vance had the Ukrainian President Zelensky in the Oval Office, and there was a real international meltdown in that scene, why did we know?
We've never seen before.
Why did we know? Yes, right. I mean, I covered some tense moments in the room, but never like that. And it affected the future of international relations. It affects the future of that war. But why did we even know about it? Because the press corps was in there. The press corps saw it and was able to report it out in real time. And so there was both a First Amendment principle of that in America, the president does not get to tell any news agency how to report the news, and also an access issue that this is not just a Washington fight about ego. This is about being able to report to the people about how the news affects them. So for all those reasons, I was just trying to, in my LinkedIn post, show people this has a broader implication to you. And, look, Washington, D.C. can take itself very seriously, and the White House press corps can take itself very seriously. And I get all that. I was inside it for a lot of years. What I always try to do is remember when I was in that role, when I asked the president a question, It's not, do I look cool? Do I look smart? Was my question better than the other person? I wasn't writing and asking about things for the White House or for the press corps or even for my editors. I was writing for so many people that I'd never had the chance to meet, the broader public, millions and millions of people. And if they were in the seat and they knew I was about to go, they'd say like, hey, Ben, you know what I really care about? Ask them about this and then write it in such a way that explains why it matters to me. I don't care about your inside politics. What matters to me? And that's why I love that job, is because I covered a lot of different things in news. But in that job, when the president said, okay, I'm going to take some questions, AP, Ben, go ahead. Right in that moment where the whole world got quiet, I'm like, I'm going to ask something here that can change the debate. And I'm trying to advance the debate. And I'm thinking about, what do people care about? So many times I travel the country with the president. This was President Bush and Obama. And I'd hear them.
I wanted to make that. I was hoping you were going to make that point, because you were in the AP during both Democratic and Republican presidents.
Yeah. And the dynamic with the two very, very different presidents in Bush and Obama, but the dynamic was often the same. They were trying to get things done that were important to them, that matched their values and their views. The press corps was an important conduit for them. They couldn't ignore us. They didn't love us. And so they used every opportunity where we had the power of the media, right, in all of our platforms to tell their story. So they were trying to go tell one story. And I would say, okay, that's fine, but I covered your campaigns and I covered all of your promises, and now you got the job. You're in charge. And oftentimes the framing of my questions was, you said you were going to do this, but I saw what you just did. You changed course. You haven't gotten it done. You compromised, which might have been a really smart move for the country, but you said you would never compromise. So when you said you're going to do A, but you actually do B, how do you account for that? And I would always be thinking about, they need to be held accountable for the promises they made, because a lot of people who are listening voted for you, and I'm the one that's going to hold you accountable. That's how I saw the job. And so fortunately now the AP is back in the building. And these are not just, it's not just the institution I'm talking about. These are friends and colleagues who I really respect, and they've been keeping up the fight and doing it really well. So I'm proud and by the way, I said, look, the AP was here long before any of us were alive. The AP will be here after. But it's really even not about one news organization. It's about, we ought to have the respect of the free press to do its job.
That's actually where I was going to go next, is, because I don't think we covered this during our first conversation years ago, but can you give us a little bit of history on like what the AP actually is, like how it got started? Because I don't think most people know that. They just, like, I'll just see like, a article or something about from the AP, but like, do people, I don't think most people actually know like what the AP is and like where it's at.
Yeah. I mean, think about it. The history of the AP goes back well over a century. So, none of us were alive when this news organization started, which is important only insofar as to say it is part of American history. Mm-hmm. That's why the AP has the reputation it does, and by tradition has gotten the first question and been one of the organizations that is always traveling with the president. It's a news collective made up of members, newspapers and radio stations, television stations from around the country and the world. And so it's a news collective. And so when the AP writes a story, it's not for a paper in Des Moines, Iowa, or Sacramento, California, or some news outlets overseas. It's for the whole world. Right, the AP is serving those news outlets, and they depend on the AP as an AP member, because most news organizations don't have the budget to have somebody covering Congress and the Supreme Court and the White House. Right, they're counting on the AP to be the eyes and ears and voice, and so there's a great responsibility to always be right, to always be fair, to be first, and to honor the responsibility that when we're writing for all of these news organizations. And so when you see AP coverage, it's really saying, they are the international body representing all of these news organizations so that they can focus on what they do best, which is covering their region, their local news, their state news. Now, AP isn't the only one that does that. Reuters is another international wire service. Bloomberg is another news service. And of course, some of the big TV networks and newspapers have international reach. And so they're also in that core group of news outlets that cover the White House. And so the AP also competes with those. That was the interesting part of it, right? It's not as if the Washington Post or the New York Times wouldn't sometimes use AP coverage for something that they didn't get to do, or they might use AP coverage in the first instance, and then they'll take over the story and write it with their own reporters. So it was both a news collective, but also there was, within that bubble, there was a competitive spirit. And so I would be, as the AP writer, trying very hard and be expected to be first in a competition among some incredibly talented and deeply, competitive reporters. By the way, that made the news better. Is we're all pushing each other. We're all trying to work sources and find out what's happening, and readers benefit from that.
So I'm still kind of interested, like, how does this collective of different media outlets kind of come together to form the AP?
Well, I mean, at this point, the AP has been a self-standing news organization with headquarters in the U.S., in New York, in D.C., and then bases around the world for so long that if you are, part of the AP collective, it's basically like a membership, right? And so you're paying into it as a newspaper or radio station, and in exchange, you are entitled to receive the coverage, and so you can count on the AP to put out internally, here are the list of things that we're following today. Here's a list of things that we're planning to cover today. And so you, as an editor of your own newspaper, radio station, can know, all right, for our readers, the AP is going to provide us this coverage, right? We're part of that cooperative, and we're going to be able to get that coverage. If they want to cover it their own way, or send one of their own reporters, then they'll do it that way. And so it's just an assurance of what's going to be covered, but also that it's going to be covered fairly, accurately, down the middle. AP also does news analysis, right? Which is a separate category to kind of step back and say, we have a story about what's happening, but we've got people who are really subject matter experts in this, who are going to provide analysis. For example, when I covered President Obama, as a White House correspondent, one of the big stories at that time was there had been an explosion in the Gulf of Mexico, which has now been renamed, right? And oil was leaking, into the Gulf, and it was, threatening the waterways around Texas and Louisiana and Florida, and it was became known as the BP oil spill. So day after day after day, this was becoming the biggest environmental disaster in American history. And there was like an underground camera showing the plume.
Yeah, I
right?
remember that.
And, CNN had it running all the time, like a little box of the video. And I think there was like maybe a day 23, day 24. And, this was not a problem that the Obama administration had caused, but if you're in that job, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who's responsible. Ultimately, the president's responsible. But Obama tried lots of different things. He kept sending out his press secretary, and he would send out government agencies and cabinet members. And, he was just his approval ratings were dropping. He was under such pressure to plug the hole. And at some point he's like, I'm not an engineer. I've got people for this. And he kept trying. And so one day he came out and said, look, there's been a lot of coverage and a lot of questions about who's responsible. He's like, I'm responsible. I'm in charge. I'm the president. And here's what I'm planning to do about it now. And he put some new, I think like a Navy admiral in charge of like, don't do anything else other than plug that hole. And he told the story about how I think his daughter Sasha who was very young at the time, had said like, Daddy, is today the day you're going to plug the hole? Like, and so I wrote a story, an analysis, and said, look, on day 37, President Obama came out and did the only thing he had left to do, like take responsibility. It doesn't matter if you caused the problem. Like that's just his job of the president. And we've seen that time and time again. So that's what the AP provides. You've got breaking news, you've got straight news, you've got analytical news. And my job for 6 of the years I was there was to keep my eyes on the president. What's he going to say? Why is he going to say it? Why did he say it? Did I get it right? Did I get it first? And Paul, the reward for that pressure, of doing that well every day was to start all over again the next day.
Yeah, the next day. Yeah, it's like the never-ending story.
Absolutely. But so marvelous life experience, but also really all-consuming. As my boss said at the time, a guy I really cherish as a mentor in my life, but he's like, look, this is not a job. This is not a career. Like, you're the chief White House correspondent. This is your life. This is the lifestyle. And then eventually I decided I didn't want that lifestyle anymore. And I left, and he's like, some people think you're crazy, because it was like tantamount to, Willy Wonka winning the golden ticket and saying like, I'm going to give it back. I don't think people think I'm crazy. I think you think I'm crazy. He's like, well, you were my guy. Like, I did it forever, and you were the one to take the mantle. I'm like, I'm 40 something years old. I got a kid. I did it really well. Like, everybody has to make their own choice about when it's right to leave. Now, ironically, after I did that, that was the start of Obama's second term. Then he's term limited out, and then Trump wins, and the world changed, and Trump called the press the enemy of the state, and so on and so on. So for me, I probably got out at the right time.
Yeah, because I think most people would see that as like such a glamorous job. I don't know if that's the right term to use, but I'll just go with it. But they don't realize what it takes to sit in that seat day after day. And like you just mentioned, it's like you had a great day today, but you know what? It doesn't carry over to the next day. You have to start again. So the one thing I want to keep pushing on is, and I think I have this right in understanding what you're saying, and my limited knowledge of AP, and going back to our previous conversation, is the independent nature of that organization. So say another news outlet that's part of this collective can take what you provide from the AP, but then they can go and take it and spin it any way that they want in their coverage of how they see the world. Correct? Is that I understand the question. I don't think that's how it would play out. It's not like they would take our coverage and then put a spin on it. What they would do is, and what news organizations often do, is take an AP story, which is national in its scope, and then localize it. So, if there's a Gulf oil spill and we're covering that, and they're in one of the affected states, they're going to be doing their own reporting about what it's like, for local businesses. Yeah, like
what the mayor's doing.
Ground level.
Yes, and so they'll have a story about that, and it'll say at the end, the Associated Press contributed to the story. Like, they're using national statistics. What the president's planning to fly in 2 days. They don't have that information, so they'll use an AP story to the degree that it rounds out the coverage. So that would be a more common example of a hybrid effect. I don't think they would take an AP story and say, like, we actually think, the president was pretty pissed off today, so we're going to inject some anger into the story, but keep the rest of it like that. If they're going to do that, they should just, not use the story or do their own thing, or, write their own analysis. Because
where I was going with that is maybe you probably figured this out with my question, my line of question with that is like today, it seems like there's all this, everything's emotional. Everything's so freaking emotional. You have all these various news outlets, whether it's NBC, ABC, CBS, CNN. It's like they all have their own quote unquote agendas. And so it's like, well, where do you ever get, or Fox, like, where do you ever get, and I just threw out Fox, but then they're still going to like, what, Fair and Balanced? And it's like, where do people go for independent, unbiased information? And I think that's where a lot of people are struggling. And what's really interesting, and I'd like to kind of expand on this, is like, since you left the AP, the whole media landscape has changed. Like now you have, these influencers, podcasters, like non-traditional media that have probably play a much bigger role in getting out news, and whether that news is factual or not is a kind of like a whole nother issue or story.
Yeah, it's gotten almost impossible to answer because the media landscape has changed so many times since I left, and there used to be understood standards of who is down the middle. Going back to the days of the original TV anchors and, Walter Cronkite,
they were the most trusted people in America.
Yeah, Edward R. Murrow, on radio and some of the major news outlets. And then it shifted to more of an understanding that, Fox had a particular leaning and MSNBC had a leaning, maybe more like CNN was down the middle, but then CNN became under attack, by Trump. And, so now you have much more of a right-left perception, even if it's not the reality. I think, having worked at the AP a long time, and a lot of my colleagues I competed with at places like the New York Times, they have an amazingly fervent belief in being independent and fair and down the middle. And so, and I think it's a very fair characterization of them. But each individual, Paul, gets to decide now. I get my news from so-and-so. I'm going to listen to NPR, or I'm specifically not going to listen to NPR. I'm going to follow my local news, or maybe even a particular writer within a newspaper, who I'm like, I trust this person, or I trust this writer, or I know that editor. And so it really comes down to individual choice. I think what a lot of people have done who find this absolutely maddening and overwhelming, like, I don't know how to trust anymore, I don't know what to do anymore, is they do a lot of reading. They have they pick up the Times and the Post, or they'll watch Fox or Newsmax, or they'll listen to a podcast that they particularly like, that they feel is pretty fair about listening to both sides. They might read a tip sheet from Politico in the morning and Axios at night. And the collective of that is like, I'm kind of seeing that Trump's having a good week or Trump's having a terrible week. Like, everybody's basically saying, Pete Hegseth's in trouble because the defense secretary shouldn't be releasing sensitive information in a group chat. Well, you're going to get Fox will cover that one way and MSNBC will cover another, but they're collectively, there's a pretty good sense of kind of what's happening and what's not. So that's one way that people get about it. But I don't think we live in a world anymore where you could say, like, okay, there's 20 magazines on a newsstand, and everybody knows that the fourth one on the right is the independent one down the middle. Like, you're just not going to find that anymore, that general consensus. And part of the reason why is that the presidents have, since the advent of the modern media, presidents have had problems with the media. They all have had, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, certainly from Nixon on up. But President Trump took it further and referred to the media as the enemy of the state, and singled out reporters, and would have people at his rallies turn around and sort of, create a tension between, them and the press, because it worked for him. And when you have people in that kind of position of power saying, like, don't believe anything, fake news, if an accurate story was unfavorable, just call it fake. You've had a concerted effort to diminish the value of independent media. Doesn't work on me because I've worked in those jobs a long time and I know how hard it is to be fair and accurate. But if you don't follow this closely and you're just like, yeah, I can't believe anything, you just sort of throw up your hands and you just kind of pick one. Or the worst part, Paul, is that some people just stop. They're like, I don't even watch the news anymore. No, I can't trust anybody. You're like, what are you basing that on? Do you know how hard those reporters are working to get you a fair story? You're like, well, I don't believe what I hear, And so then you just have to throw up your hands. They're like, all right, well, it comes down to individual responsibility. I mean, I'm sure you have your own news, consumption habits that you've probably thought through over time, right?
Yeah, I sure do. And that's that you're leading right into in the next subject I want to talk about, because like one of the things since so we're recording this towards the end of April. Earlier this month, the trade war or tariffs started, And I've been preaching to the families I work with at Tama for years and now like decades about trying to tune out the noise.
Mm-hmm.
But when I say that, Ben, I make sure I try to follow it up with, that doesn't mean you turn off the news or the radio or whatever news source that you go to, because you still want to be informed. I think what people really struggle with, kind of like what we've been talking about, is, well, who do I trust? And so, yeah, to your point, like I feel like I have trusted sources that I go to day in and day out for my news, and specifically when it comes to my world of financial planning and portfolio management. What I want my families to not have to worry about is what's going on with their portfolios because of what's going on in DC or overseas or wherever it may be, that they know that I have a firm grasp on what's going on and how it may impact their portfolios. But at the end of the day, my typical answer is, and just like this blip, I just call it that we've had here in April about these tariffs, will be just that. Because if you look at a long-term chart of the S&P 500, going back to when it was established in the early 50s till today, you see a line that goes from the bottom left to the upper right with some bumps along the way, and that's what this is. And I think if you don't believe that, then there's a deeper rooted issue that I think people have, where they have stopped believing in America. They have stopped believing in independence. And I know that some people, both on the left and the right, have called me and like, well, what about like what happened in World War II with Hitler and the Nazis, and like who spoke up for those people? Like, no one's speaking up for us today. I'm like, well, these things, and you've seen this because you've had the front row seat, Ben. This pendulum shifts so much from like the people that had expectations of when they voted for Biden or Trump. If those expectations aren't filled, those people can swing back the other way, and a new administration comes in, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean,
there was a lot to unpack there.
No.
Take wherever you want to go.
I think that a couple things. First of all, your answer there for your clients is a mix of facts and emotion. There is a chart of stock market valuation over time that has gone from bottom left to upper right over time. That's why long-term investing is what it is. But there's also the emotion to it. It's like, well, I don't know. You don't know that that's going to continue. You don't know how I'm feeling, right? You don't know how nervous it makes me when I bring up my app and I see that it's dropped that much. And it's like, well, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about what's happening? Or are we talking about how you feel about what's happening? And both of those things are really important. You need to be able to.
Different. They are distinctly different.
They are two different things, but they mash together in the work that you do and in the work that we do in helping our clients figure out how to say what they're trying to say so that their audiences hear them. And there are all kinds of reasons why audiences don't hear them. But it's not just because they're not hearing the facts. Some of it is that there's not a clear language that explains who they are and what they do. But a big part of it is like, are you talking to them in the way they need to be heard? With emotion, with brevity, with clarity, with order, with tone. Like, those are all hard things to do. But if you invest in that and get it right, you're going to be shocked about how well you're going to do, and your story's going to succeed because you've taken the time to check with audiences. And so it's just so important to see both these things of like, understand factually what's happening, but then also understand the emotion of it too. And that's why, again, that the example we talked about earlier that happened in the Oval Office between J.D. Vance, Vice President Vance, President Trump, and President Zelensky. I was actually at a lunch when that happened. And ironically, the person I was having lunch with and I had both agreed to we put our phones down because we were having lunch. But she had gone so far as to do a digital detox that day. And so she wasn't looking at anything. And my phone was kind of blowing up. And I turned off the sound, but the news alert after news alert, because that was an international event happening in real time, this dispute. And again, when I got out of lunch, I'm like, I got to find out more. so I was looking, on Twitter, and I was looking, reading some of these news alerts. And ultimately, I'm like, you know what I need to do, Paul? I need to watch the video of what happened. And so I found it, and it was unfiltered. So that's how I chose to do it. It wasn't like I didn't believe the media. If I'm seeing a news alert that says like fierce showdown or meltdown or, fireworks, I'm like, that seems like that's probably what happened. But if I'm like, oh, I can't believe anybody, I'm like, well, go straight to the source and watch the video. I'm like, yeah, that was fiery and unprecedented. And by the way, it goes back full circle. How did we know that? Because the press was in the room. Access matters, But to your point about deeper rooted, if you do find people that are just like, I can't believe in America anymore, I can't believe in the market anymore, I can't believe in the media anymore, that is unfortunate. That is deeper rooted, because we still have some things that we can believe in. And part of it is being advisors who can bring people back to that moment and say, there are still some good things that you can count on. Let's focus on those.
Do you miss it? Do you miss being in that pressure cooker hot seat, which is, pure adrenaline on one point, and then just like, oh my gosh, what am I doing?
No, I don't miss it for two reasons. One is I think that there's a real value. I've been around a while. I've been in the communications field for a long time. I think there's a real value in appreciating a chapter of your life, how it shaped you, what it meant for you, how it affects what energy you bring into the world. But chapters end. You don't always know when exactly the right time for a chapter is to end, or sometimes you don't have control over when your chapters end. But I've gotten much better about not trying to sort of stay in a previous chapter. And that White House period was just that. 2 administrations, 6 years, which covering the AP White House beat feels much longer than 6 years.
Yeah, I can
traveling the world. I've had a totally different chapter after that, which includes moving into business, becoming a strategic advisor, a partner at 2 firms, becoming a first-time author of a children's book about problem solving. That book was directly because of being a very present father, one I wouldn't have been if I had stayed in. So I don't miss it, because I think I've just reflect on life's chapters come and go, and you don't try to stay in the past. That's something I've tried hard to do. The other reason is that like, for me, it's, some people won't agree with this, but you've had me on your podcast, so I get to give you my opinion. In some ways, it's a younger person's job. Like it is just so consuming. At least it was as I remembered it. I mean, the last thing I ever covered was in 2012, and it was who President Obama was going to pick as the Secretary of State for the second term. It was either going to be John Kerry or Susan Rice. Ended up being Kerry, but that was the breathless story of the night, because the whole world, depended on who was going to get this cabinet position, in breathless Washington. And I chased it, and I was waiting a call back from a source, because I think ABC News was reporting something, and my editing desk was going crazy. We got to match it. We got to advance it. And I fell asleep with the phone on my chest, waiting for a call back. And that's how I woke up. Like that was like a weight, literal weight on my chest. I'm like, so someone says, oh, you don't miss it? Like the adrenaline and the parties and the plane. I'm like, that's all cool. That stuff was great. But like, that's not really what was, I was carrying that 24/7 weight around all the time. And I don't want to do that now. I got enough other things going on. So when people ask if they miss it, I understandably, they're saying like the mansion and the glamour and the TV coverage. But the real job was what I just described. And you got to love that. You got to love it to do it. And I did. And I was really good at it. But then at some point, the other things that are become more important in life. And that's where the scale tipped. And what I couldn't do, Paul, was kind of be like 80%, 83%. That's not me. I'm either in or I'm not. And I decided it was time to go.
Yeah, because as I stare at the how do I want to describe this? The evil Empire place that's behind you on your wall.
Yankee Stadium. I was wondering where you were going with that.
You were calling that, but I'm a Boston guy, so.
Well, why do you think it's taken me a few years to talk to you again?
That's right. That's why you never call back. I think to put it in sports terms, because obviously, we're recording this specifically on April 24th, and the NFL draft is tonight. Mm-hmm. And people have this perception, I think, of how glamorous it is to be a sports player or a professional sports athlete. Mm-hmm. And I can't even. I grew up playing baseball. Loved it. I can barely watch the sport today, but I can't imagine grinding through 162 games in a season. And then just even going back and thinking about what Cal Ripken did all those years, continuous game streak, like how people can see that from an outsider point of view as just like, oh my gosh, that's got to be the greatest job ever. But like when you're in the arena, like it's not all that glamorous. When I can't imagine it, because we talk about life transitions all the time on this podcast. This podcast will turn 5 years old, and I can't believe that.
Oh, congratulations. That's amazing.
We still keep it going. With life transitions, I think if that's the one thing that's been a common theme over the last 5 years, and awareness of life transitions, that's been, I think, the key theme of this. And I can't imagine like how it's like an athlete when they retire, that's like part of them is missing, like what that life transition must have been like for you to go through. Because on one hand, you probably missed some of that adrenaline, but on the other hand, it's like you probably had to teach yourself how to slow down and to be able to breathe again.
Yeah. Well, so, when I think about your so well named emotional, balance sheet theme, I was definitely trying to find the balance at the time. And so the first year out from journalism, because it had been 20 years, was absolutely a transition. And it wasn't a matter of so much miss it or not miss it. It was more like, who am I? And somebody might listen to that and say, like, what are you talking about? Like, it was the job that you did, the profession you were in. It wasn't who you are. But I got into that at, age 20, 21, and I was on deadline nonstop for 20 years. And it took me from covering local parades and the start of bear hunting season in central Pennsylvania all the way up to, secret trips to Afghanistan with the president. I'd done the whole ride. And then when the music stops, you're like, whoa, it doesn't matter what my new business card says. I guess I'm now a strategic advisor. I'm a communications advisor. It took a while for me to recalibrate, who I was, because it wasn't just my job title. It was my identity. I'm a reporter. But I did the choice intentionally. I thought I did it thoughtfully. And I also am a bit of a risk taker. And I took a bet on myself that there's going to be a second chapter for me. And it worked. And so, but the tricky part about that is so I can answer with absolute confidence and clarity. And no, I don't miss it. It was a marvelous life experience. I don't want to go back. I'm glad I'm not there. But also, it's not like we're like, oh, well, then you figured it out. Like, no, that's not how life works. Like, you're always figuring it out. And this is where I think a lot of people get uncomfortable, because they want to hear that people have either made a good decision or a bad decision, or changed a bad decision into a good decision. There's not as much patience I think people have for like, maybe, or I don't know, or I'm figuring it out, or like, yeah, it's going good, but I didn't say it was going great. Like I'm in the pursuit of happiness and the pursuit of greatness. Like I wrote a piece years ago now, but there's a reason why they called it the pursuit of happiness, not the attainment of happiness. Is that some of us are just wired to constantly be saying, how do I find a happier place? How do I spend more time on the things that are the highest and best use to me? And so I've been outside the journalism world you're asking about now for 12 years. And so that's a long period of time.
Yeah, it's a whole nother. It's like a whole nother life.
Whole nother life. Like those athletes. I would never compare myself to a professional athlete, but sometimes some of the people that know the athletes that I grew up on now don't even see them as athletes. They only see them as sports commentators or podcast hosts, because they never saw them play, because they've been out that long. And so, and I can't believe there are people walking around who never saw Michael Jordan play. I'm like, who do you compare excellence to? Like, well, they're LeBron, or LeBron's next generation. So, I think that it's important to, I think, lean into this fact of like, no, we're always trying to find the right balance. And, one thing you and I were talking about offline is, how do you honor the progress that you've made along the way? If you are a driven person who has a lot of demands on his or her life, and you and I haven't talked in a few years, and I bet if I walked you through everything that I've done in the last 3 years, you'd probably say like, wow, I was talking to you right when you were about to start that job. Right. What progress? And I'm looking at it like, no. Here are all the things I haven't done yet. And so sometimes it takes an outside voice to kind of pull you back to your own balance sheet and say, you've actually got a lot more on the ledger than you realize. So that's the work that I'm always doing, is trying to be focused on the future, but also take a breath, to your point, and breathe in some of the things that I've done and have perspective, which is something I wrote about in my children's book, is perspective. It's so hard to keep perspective when you live in a very fast-paced world. There's just no time for it.
Yeah, and specifically, and we've talked about this, or I've talked about this on the podcast numerous times over the years. What you're referring to is Dan Sullivan's book, The Gap and the Gain. And it really changed my perspective 3 or 4 years ago when I first read Dan's book and been following his work now for years. Is Dan's point is, if you're always looking to measure yourself at the horizon, it's never going to work. You're going to be what he calls in the gap, versus the gain. And I think this is what people really struggle with, is to be able to move forward, you have to actually be able to look back like where you started from and where you're at today, and live and be in that gain. Because if you're always looking at the horizon's never changing. It's constant. And if you're always trying to, reach that horizon, you're going to be sadly disappointed, because you can never reach the horizon, because it's always going to be, whatever analogy you want to use, a step or a hand
right
in front of you, or arm's length in front of you. You can never reach out and grasp it. And that was Dan's point in messaging, is that, in order to be able to feel or understand what you've accomplished, you've got to be able to look back.
So when you read that, can I just ask you quickly,
Yeah.
has that helped you?
Tremendously. Yeah. I think some people, probably not including my wife, Teresa, they've noticed a major difference in my mental makeup or mentality, I think, over the last couple years. And people have been asking me more and more often, like, what changed? And I think there's two things that have really made an impact on, maybe probably more than that, but two that I always kind of reference is this understanding. Because when I come into my office every day, it's like it's such a blessing, because of who I get to work with, the type of work that I do, the impact that I have on families' lives is so meaningful. And like, I didn't have that during my, talk about two different lives, like my corporate career life, where I was, in that world for 20, 25 years. I didn't have that feeling like I do today. But like, looking back, Tama will be 15 years old when my triplets turn 15 this December. And looking back at where I was starting this 15 years ago, I could have never imagined it would turn out the way it did. Like, I wrote it down on paper, like my expectations, and I've exceeded all those expectations. So it's Brian Portnoy is big on this. I've had him on the show before. He's a good friend of mine, talking about funded contentment and helping define like what enough is. And my other, I'll call him a friend, but Morgan Housel, prolific writer, always talks about this concept of enough and the goalpost moving. So I'm always cognizant of that. But I think the other game changer for me, and I started doing this, I think 2 years ago, is when I start my day, typically like a Monday through a Friday, one of the first things I do to start my daily routine is to write down 3 things that I'm thankful for or grateful for every day. And it seems it may seem trite, may seem like too simple, but I swear to God, like, I think changing my mindset and getting focused on what has helped me get to where I'm at today, the people, the relationships, my family, my friends, meeting people like you, have had this overwhelming effect of getting in that right mindset to start the day. Because going back to what we've talked about a time or two now already is, when you look at that chart of the stock market, like, it's easy to get pessimistic.
Right.
It's sometimes really hard to be the optimist. And I realized that from the portfolio management hat that I wear, like, I need to be more of the optimist. Like, there's always a reason to sell. Like there's a great chart that Michael Batnick, who's a friend of mine, puts out, and he updates it throughout the year. It's always a reason to sell. It's got the same chart of the S&P 500, but all these reasons to sell. What's the reason to buy? There's no chart that has that except, when it's just going up to the right. So I think that was a long-winded answer to your question, which
great,
I really
though.
appreciate that.
No, I appreciate it. I'm sure the people listening appreciate it too, because it's an invisible problem, I think.
Yeah.
To be able to appreciate what you have, still be driven, have perspective, not get too focused on the horizon that the morning gratefulness. I've heard routines like that before. It's just all good to hear.
So I know I don't have you for much longer. How would you leave our conversation? Like what one or two points would you want the people listening to understand about where we're at from the landscape of probably media, but maybe more so the point that you mentioned earlier about being able to find your own source of truth and have that sense of awareness that not everything is wrong in the world.
Yeah, well, I'll answer that final point with a question for you first, which is there's a piece of artwork behind you, and I can only see part of it. And it says things you can control. It's a Venn diagram. What's in the other circle?
So yeah, that's by Carl Richards, who's a good friend of mine. He wrote for the New York Times a column like for 10 years, a sketch guy. And it's things that matter, things that you can control.
Yeah.
And then in the middle where it's shaded, actually, I'll move my camera over a little bit so I think the audience can see it. What you should focus on. And that is something that when people that I work with at TAMA, when the families see their one-page wealth management plan, that's on the very top. And that's what I try to focus on. And I try to have the same conversations with my kids about this, about, what you can control and what you can't control and what you should be focused on. And it's the same way with the TAMA families.
Yeah, that's great. I might get that for my office too, because
I'll send you one, Ben.
All right, that would be great. I think, because I think about this a lot, and that's probably where I would take your question is, we're living in a time when this is cyclical, but I feel like it's in a hot point right now where a lot of people that I talk to don't feel very good because there's too many things happening that they don't feel they have any control over. It's not a good way to wake up in the morning, to run a business, to be present in your family, if you're always on your back foot waiting for something bad to happen. And so what I've been trying to do is actively remind our clients that there's much more happening that you have control over than you think. And that is what you should be focusing on. For example, we have some clients that are deeply invested in the importance of diversity in the workplace, and DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion has, been banned by the federal government in the federal workforce, and they're coming after companies that and universities that still commit to it. And so some of these companies are like, well, what the hell do we do? I mean, this is part of who we are. This is how we recruit. It's a core value. We can't talk about it. We can't do it anymore. And I'm like, look, I'm not a lawyer. I can't advise you on how the executive orders affect, right, your business model. But you still have control over when you wake up in the day. Who are you? Who are you as a company? What do you do? How is it different? And why should people care? Think about those 4 questions and how well you can answer those. And those are not subject to executive order, congressional midterms, which news outlets you like. You have much more control over what you believe in, how you tell your story, what your audiences care about. And sure, if it gets into a sensitive area like diversity, maybe you have to have somebody review it from legally. But, don't stay in a corner right now. Don't let somebody else define who you are. Affirmatively wake up and say, like, this is what we do. This is who we are. This is what we stand for. And in a competitive world, this is how we're different. And the more that you attack those things with passion and clarity, not only are you more likely to succeed, you're just more likely to feel better.
Yeah.
You know, and somebody says, hey, did you see what so-and-so did? You're like, you know what? I didn't. Here's what I did. Here's what my people care about, just like your clients, Paul. And I think it's just a good reminder to go into each day on our front foot and thinking, like, what are the things that I can control and how well am I telling my story? Because if I don't, it's somebody else is going to do it. And that is just a better, much healthier, better place to live, to think, and how to spend your time. So that's my advice. That's what I'm trying to do for myself and our company. And I hope that's helpful to your listeners as well.
Well, this has been just a phenomenal conversation, and it's kind of it showcases, I think, the powerfulness of these conversations where I have somebody like you on, I write down one question and it goes from there. Yeah. And I can't thank you enough, Ben, for being on. And I promise you, it won't be another 3 years before you're on again.
Well, I appreciate that. I don't want it to be that long either. I enjoy the reflections and conversations a lot. And, you know, the book that I wrote, Big Problems, Little Problems, it was a point in time when my son was young, but it's also something that I'm always working on. You know, how do you make big problems? How do you turn big problems into little problems? And it's a worthy pursuit, Paul, and it's something that I think good conversations like this help with it. So I thank you a lot.
Yeah, no problem. And by the way, audience, be sure to check out the show notes because I will have a link to the LinkedIn post that Ben wrote. By all means, connect with him on LinkedIn. He puts out some great posts. And I'll also have a link to his book, Big Problems, Little Problems as well. Great read, especially for parents with any age kids, I would say, but especially younger ones. So, but Ben, thank you so much for being on, and I'll look forward to talking to you again soon.
All right. Thank you, my friend. Good to see you.
You too. Now that you've made it to the end of another great conversation, are you looking for more? If so, head over to tamacapital.com, where you will find all of our conversations. Use the search feature to find the topic or guest you would love to learn more about. Also, don't forget to make someone else's day by sharing our show. Thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.